¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos nuevamente a una nueva conferencia del Centro de Estudios de Arquitectura Contemporánea. Hoy tendremos una conferencia de Ilaria Di Carlo, cuyo nombre es Impurity, Ecology as Aesthetic Form. Es una conferencia que se da en el contexto del ciclo Paisajes Disciplinares. Es un ciclo organizado entre el SEAC y el programa en Arquitectura del Paisaje, el programa que es coordinado por Juan Pablo Porta, que ahora en breves instantes los voy a dejar con él, que dará una presentación de Ilaria y del contexto en el cual se da la conferencia. Ahí está. Ok. Como les decía, el ciclo Paisajes Disciplinares es un ciclo que se lleva a cabo durante ambos semestres, y la idea es explorar el impacto disciplinar de las prácticas ligadas al paisaje, y en ese sentido evolucionar las técnicas tradicionales de manipulación del paisaje y hacerlas tender hacia nuevas formas capaces de integrar proyectos y procesos dinámicos de organización. Y en ese sentido lo que nos interesa son las relaciones que se establecen entre las prácticas paisajísticas, urbanas y territoriales, examinando sus dimensiones culturales e históricas, y especulando también sobre la potencialidad de sus medios como agentes de innovación en la arquitectura contemporánea. Bueno, muy bien. Entonces los dejo con Juan Pablo, que hará una presentación de Ilaria, y luego tendremos la conferencia de Ilaria. Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo, si estás por ahí. Perfecto.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos. Bueno, como decía Manuel, la conferencia de Ilaria se enmarca dentro del programa para la arquitectura del paisaje. El programa es un programa de 1 año de duración, con algunas materias teóricas, técnicas y algunas proyectuales, en las cuales se destaca el taller, que es como la espina dorsal del programa y se extiende durante todo el año. Este taller este año está trabajando con una agenda en torno a lo que denominamos paisajes de extracción, en el contexto de todo lo que es el territorio de Vaca Muerta. Además de este taller, el área de proyecto del programa tiene una materia que denominamos seminario taller, el cual se ubica a la mitad del año, y que siempre está liderado por un profesor invitado, que en el caso de este año es Ilaria. Voy a leer brevemente. El seminario terminó el sábado. Fue una semana intensa de trabajo en torno a los paisajes de extracción y una visión que ahora Ilaria va a contar en su conferencia. No sé, creo que también va a mostrar algunos de los trabajos que realizaron con los alumnos. Voy a leer brevemente la biografía de Ilaria. Ilaria es arquitecta, urbanista, escritora e investigadora, graduada con honores en el Politécnico de Milán y máster en Landscape Urbanism por la Arquitectura Association de Londres. Concluyó además su investigación de doctorado en Environmental Engineering con su tesis titulada The Aesthetics of Sustainability, Systemic Thinking and Self-Organization in the Evolution of Cities, que luego se publicó como libro. Antes de fundar su estudio, con sede en Roma, Ilaria trabajó para diferentes oficinas internacionales, fue associate en SOM Londres. Actualmente es tutora en History and Theory en la BPro EMARC en Urban Design de la Bartlett UCL, Faculty of the Built Environment in Londres, y es codirectora del AA Visiting School de Milán, asociación académica entre la Arquitectura Association y el Politécnico. Ha sido conferencista en varias instituciones del mundo y participa regularmente como ponente en simposios y conferencias internacionales. es autora de numerosos artículos científicos. Su interés de investigación se centra en la importancia de la estética revisada a través de los lentes del pensamiento sistémico, la teoría de la complejidad y la transdisciplinaridad, y en el diseño sostenible de la ciudad y el territorio. Sin más, los dejo entonces con Hilaria. Al final de la conferencia vamos a estar nombrando las preguntas que hagan por el chat, los que están mediante la plataforma Zoom. Gracias, Hilaria. Te doy el paso a vos.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen so we can start with the presentation. Okay. So the title of this lecture is Impurity, Ecology as a Form of Aesthetics. Notes on Contamination, which is the same title of the workshop that Juan Pablo was mentioning a moment ago that I ran with the students of the Universidad de Tella. And I thought that the title of the workshop was also a good title for the lecture, as somehow it summarizes the work that I have been doing in the past years. The lecture, what is going to be, it's going to be divided into, let's say, a theoretical introduction on the elaboration of what ecological design could be and how it transposes into the aesthetic concept of impurity. And a second part where I will present some works coming both from the academia and from the practice, and that will describe the idea of cartographies of subjectivities, which are examples of contaminations working on the concept of patterns as ecological aesthetic agency. Now, you will need to somehow pardon my quite long philosophical introduction today, but I felt that it was kind of necessary, not because I teach history and theory, but because for me, this crisis that we are living now, which in many aspects is an ecological crisis, at heart is a philosophical one. So what is ecological design? I would like to start this conversation with a video about the work of the artist Hubert Dupois. I always somehow like to tap into the world of art, as often in art we experience conceptually and materially what then after some times becomes practices. Like in this particular work that you will see that was actually created in the early 1980s. So it's almost 40 years old, but it's strikingly how incredibly actual it still is. So let's look together at this video.
Alors les trichoptères sont des insectes qui sont présents dans la plupart des rivières de la planète. C'est un insecte donc très fréquent et qui a la particularité de fabriquer un tube de protection avec des matériaux qu'il emprunte dans son milieu. Donc en général des cailloux, des petits morceaux de bois, des feuilles et parfois même des coquilles d'escargot. En me disant, et je connais cet animal qui fabrique un tube artificiel avec des matériaux qu'il trouve autour de lui, et j'ai appris grâce à ses amis que l'or était présent dans la rivière. Donc je me suis dit, pourquoi pas? Est-ce que l'animal, la nature, aurait le choix? Est-ce qu'il pourrait prendre de l'or? En tout cas, moi j'ai décidé dans une structure artificielle, dans une sorte de laboratoire, de lui donner cet or, et l'animal n'a pas eu d'autre choix que de confectionner son étui avec l'or, puisque je l'ai privé de tous les autres matériaux. Le travail avec les trichoptères est un travail de collaboration entre moi et les trichoptères. Disons que je crée les conditions favorables pour que les talents du trichoptère puissent éclore. Je crée des situations et je suis un peu comparable à l'architecte qui fait travailler les maçons. Comment les idées me viennent? Le problème, c'est que je ne sais pas comment elles viennent.
So this Cadiz lab work, it's basically the work to build their shells, their home. And they do it with the material that they find available in the environment, like pebbles, leaves, pieces of woods, and other sort of debris that they gather from the water. And so they stitch them together and they strengthen their silk cocoon with this material. But once they are forced into an alternative environment, like the water tank, which is completely filled with small golden chips or cubes of precious and semi-precious stones, the insects use their own technique to adjust and to adapt to the new situation. And they are capable to perform the most successful and exquisite act of environmental resilience and adaptability, cooperating with the environment at the same time. So in a way, they are a beautiful and a successful metaphor for us humans and for our need to adjust to this COVID-19 scenario and to the post-COVID-19 scenario. But what is more interesting for me is that this project is also telling us another story. That is that we need to acknowledge that the environment is constituted by an ecology of different forms of intelligences, where humans are just one form of biochemical intensity. And each one of these intensity has what Manuel de Landa used to call material expressivity, which is basically the way in which every matter expresses itself. And this concept of material expressivity is somehow the aesthetic answer to a much bigger philosophical question about nature and culture. And it's the answer that envisions an ecological anti-dialectic perspective on nature and humankind. It's that kind of disposition that we find in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's writings, where he unifies the traditional dichotomy between nature and artificiality, and artificiality becomes an evolution and a transfiguration of nature. This image, which is one of the living bridges of Cherrapunji in India, is for me a very clear transfiguration, or if you want, a simulacrum of this topic. You might be familiar with the structure, but if you don't, they are suspended bridges formed by the living aerial roots of rubber fig trees, which are organized by the local people. And this image represents a fact that there is no natural original space on Earth because everything has been modified by an infinite quantity of individual and living species. Therefore, ecology can become political when it accepts that in nature everything is artificial and nothing is natural. But most of all, that everything is interconnected. And the idea of this communicative interconnection among all living beings is at the base of Gregory Bateson's work on ecology and his concept of ecology of mind. Bateson argued that the nature-culture dualism was a special form of mind-matter dualism. And he developed an ecological theory of mind, which in his word was neither supernatural nor mechanical. For Bateson, the ecology of the living world is full of minds. And today we might call much of what Bateson meant with mind as agency. And Bateson argued that it's necessary to transform not just ecological knowledge, but the very basis of science in general, with an aesthetic dimension that for him was a recognition that ecological patterns are minds, and that this is the only way to grasp the interconnectedness of environmental entities and relations. And this line of thoughts that somehow annihilates the dichotomies between nature and culture, science and humanities, material and mental, and also between aesthetics and ethics, is the same one advocated by the French philosopher Félix Guattari. In his seminal text, the Three Ecologies, he condemned basically the practice of regarding the socius, the psyche, and the environment as separated. And instead, he declared the urgent need to rather apprehend the world through these three interchangeable lenses. And Guattari's position on aesthetics and ecology was very, very clear. For him, any ecological discourse must be aesthetic as well as ethical in order to be meaningful. And why? Because aesthetics are not only a form of knowledge, but they have the power to grab attention and grab and attract affects, and to convey also difficult or ambiguous concepts like this picture of Burtynsky, which depicts nickel tailings. The photographer used a particular look. He managed to capture in the light, in the frame, in the saturation of the colors, a fascinating image. A kind of dialogue between the repulsion generated by the frame subject, which is a polluted nature, and the attraction that the abstract image from the context generates. So the strong and bold aesthetics of the image succeeded to convey that feeling of struggle and of ambivalence that often come along with the ecological debate. And it's what Guattari calls the aesthetic decentering of point of views, which is a deconstruction of structures and codes in use that is very typical of any polyphotic reduction of the components of expression. And in the contemporary ecosophical discourse, this decentering point of view mentioned by Guattari is revisited in the metaphysical notion of the object-oriented ontologies, and is identified not only as an agent with the centering point of views, but also as a decentering and distributed agency with different point of views. And following the definition of Bruno Latour, an actant, which is a source of actions, can be either human or non-human. So therefore, if you think about it in terms of design process, we could argue that an ecological praxis is based on aesthetic assemblages of collaborative rationalities, which are human and non-human, computational and non-computational. And these domains and agencies, for me, must be searched across other practices, other species, other ecological intensities, in a spirit of collaboration, somehow reconfiguring the notion of agencies and subjectivity. And it's the dialogue that in social science, Latour with his actor network theory envisions as the parliament of things, where every object has a voice in the democracy of the planet. It's a sort of an ontological approach which tries to explain how material semiotic networks come together to act as a whole. By the way, this image and the image before were by Tomás Saraceno, who you most probably know being Argentinian. And Saraceno's research is inspired by the similarities noted by scientists between the string-like theory composition of the cosmic network and the complex mesh of spider webs. And the work is not only a metaphoric exercise, but it calls back to the notion of patterns. And these patterns that Latour called network were taken again and developed further into the idea of mesh by Timothy Morton. Morton argues on the same line of Bateson that all forms of life are interconnected in this vast entangling mesh. And this interconnectedness penetrates all dimensions of life. So no being, no construct, nor objects can exist independently from the ecological entanglement. And it's realizing this interconnectedness that he calls ecological thought. So this image, which is a work by Anthony Gormley and is called Matrix III, apart from recalling us the eponymous moving and sharing with it the idea of this hyperdimensionality of space and time, it tells you another story. If you put yourself right under it, as the girl is doing in the picture, you will feel that sense of vertical vertigo as a sort of an embodiment of the space, as if you were tempted to to fall into it. And so you will perceive yourself inside this matrix, inside this mesh. So you will feel part of this interconnectedness. So going back to Norton, this mesh is the interconnectedness, is an hyperobject which is capable to link everything and to create that sense of intimacy which can better explain ecological awareness. But the mesh for Morton is also an agency which is seeking an aesthetic mode that cannot account, or it will aim to account for the differential, paradoxical, and non-identificational character of the environment. So in a way, ecology brings along also a revaluation of the idea of aesthetics. So now that we have more or less understood what ecosophy is about, let's look more closely to aesthetics. Now, aesthetics can be read and described following two different patterns, as an image-making process and as a knowledge-making process. And as we will see, both of them contemplate an idea of impurity within their ontology. If we want to follow Bourrienne's theory of form, the impure is that sort of formal disorder which is inherent to dialogue. And this dialogue is the actual origin of the image-making process, while the exchange of information is the aesthetic experience itself. It's that sense of, if you want, disorder that Francesco Milizia, who was one of the most rigid and rigorous neoclassical architects, defended as one of the quintessential quality of the city. In other words, we can compare it with those moments when we find ourselves in a city with a state of mind of exploration, and we deeply enjoy that sense of surprise and so also variety, that disorder, that exuberance that the city has to offer. And the aesthetic experience that goes with it breeds out of centuries of old dialogues among different actors of the city. And today we might call those ecologies. So now such dialogue among different actors of the image-making process make the process a sort of a choral and collective form of intervention. And it marks the clear departure from an authorial attitude to a polyarchic assemblage. But as dialogue can be seen as the origin of the image-making process, the aesthetic experience is not just a form of semiotic information exchange. Beside its intrinsic quality, actually, it's a form of knowledge. And in fact, neuroscience teaches us something very important through the embodied simulation theory, that in a precognitive phase, we first empathize emotionally and physiologically with what surrounds us. And only at a later stage, we understand it consciously. We understand the source of the aesthetic experience, and then cognitively, its reason and its meaning. What does it mean? It means that in this light, aesthetics is a form of knowledge of any ecology with a sensing body. So be it human, non-human, computational, or non-computational. So aesthetics is no competence, nor ability, nor property exclusive of the human nature, but it only depends on the different sensing apparatus of each agency, or on what Jacob von Uexküll defined as the Umwelt, which is a specific model of the world corresponding to a given creature sensorium. This, by the way, is the image of a butterfly wing as seen on the microscope, so the butterfly sensorium. So if we go back to the initial idea that the environment is constituted by an ecology of different forms of intelligence, and about the work of Duprat, the work of Duprat is actually telling us a story. It's a story about information theory, ecophenomenology, epistemology, aesthetics, but of course also about design. And it's telling us that this sort of contaminations, this interspecies design, are not just about the creation of aesthetic assemblages, but are about the relational construction of space, time, and value through the symbiosis of different forms of intelligence, defined by open-endedness, inclusiveness, with the goal of improving and intensifying relations, networks, exchanges, in order to produce what in relational aesthetics are called intersubjective encounters, which are practices and agencies where meaning is created collectively and not consumed individually. So applied to the urban, this new paradigm where the notion of a single human authorship with intellectual ownership and its aesthetic language is somehow substituted by a concept of a collective of humans and non-human ecologies, which might recover the aesthetic real fundamental meaning as ecological category. So it's in this acceptation of interaction and mixtures of interchanges and crossing of energies that we can finally detect one of the fundamental keys of the complexity theory. And it's not the old notion of quality as an essential and pure identity related to cathartic category, but a more diffuse and impure one. And this is a very important aesthetic statement. It suggests that in a dynamic system where everything is in motion and it's based on a constant condition of articulation and connection, and with a mutating tendency, quality cannot be related just to pureness, homogeneity, uniformity, and refinement, but to a more complex meaning of sophistication by collaboration, by contamination of multiple resonances and superimpositions. And as Emanuele Coccia says, this mixture is not pollution, it's a new form of cohabitation that overcomes the idea of purity that the concept of ecosystem itself continues to suppose. In other words, as Lovenputzing says, purity is not an option. If we want to pursue a meaningful and informed ecological discourse, we must acknowledge that contamination are a form of livable or bearable collaboration. She says something really interesting. She says, everyone carries a history of contamination. Purity is not an option. Survival requires livable collaborations. Collaboration means working across differences, which leads to contamination. So contamination is a great word within the ecological discourse. It's about contamination among disciplines, among practices, among different forms of rationalities, among different species, and is indispensable to the success of any actions when tackling an ecological agenda. So contaminations are powerful and can become poetic if properly addressed. And they do not have to tell a story of aggression or violence or dirtiness. They can be turned into histories of kindness, of negotiation, and of sophistication. So now, how are we going to connect all these theories above with some design methodology? Well, I personally always try to think in terms of models and tools, and especially critical and spatial models and tools. So in terms of models, I believe that the key to this challenge resides in the concept of collaboration. And in terms of the tools, I believe that we should look at that form of metaphysical and mental infrastructure that we apply when we search for a new praxis, and which is called transdisciplinarity, which is about transgressing boundaries in search of, let's call it a meta language, which would allow to properly address models and technique migrating not only from other disciplines and other codes, but also from other ecological agencies and domains, which is basically the equivalent of the Caddis-Larder project. And the output of this process is what I call cartographies of subjectivity, which are patterns of human and non-human ecologies to read and organize space and knowledge through the interface of aesthetics. Now, the word cartography refers to the capacity of forming and deforming and informing visions of the world, while the world subjectivity represents the mental and aesthetic ecology of all the different actants in the world. So all the projects that you will see are examples of contaminations, working on the concept of patterns as ecological aesthetic agency to connect different forms of rationality and create relational construction of space, time, and value. Now, in a way, we will talk about patterns as a sort of schemes of potential genesis, which are meshes that have acquired identity. So let's look together at some examples. And of course, we start with the work done together with Juan Pablo Porta and Sofia Damjanovic and the students of the postgraduate degree in landscape architecture. The Taller this year, as Juan Pablo mentioned, was working on the landscape of extraction. The work of this sort of very short and intense week seminar wanted to somehow plug into this discourse, trying to set up an ecological agenda through the creation of patterns as form of analog computation to read and organize the territory through, as I said, the interface of aesthetics. Students were given 4 different actants, and these actants were chosen on the basis of all of them sharing the same 3 conditions: their presence in the territory of Vaca Muerta, a link with water, and a link with the strong environmental issues. And they were asked to map and organize the behavior of these other rationalities within the landscape, choosing to represent the point of view of these other intelligences, and then to test these different intelligences, challenging their performance in one or more tasks through the manipulation of the pattern. And the exercise was broken into manageable parts, which were the choice of the intelligence, the identification of qualitative and quantitative components of the pattern, the construction of the set of rules to the change of the pattern, populating the site with the pattern, and then challenging the performance of the pattern. And the idea was to direct the students to connect with other forms of rationalities and to read the environment through their intelligence or material expressivity, having in mind some basic notions about natural intelligence and ecology, such as that spatial values are encoded in patterns, and intelligence is specific to a domain, is related to social patterns, evolves through adaptive and responsive behavior to the environment, and works in a series of hierarchies across spatial scales. So the results are a series of cartographies which have tried to speculate on one more characteristic of the specific ecology taken into consideration, like this case, the flamingos. The pattern is a very rich and articulated social interactions, which is not human, but whose sociality has a great impact on the territory and on the ecology of the environment. And the pattern is evolving through a series of motions, tracking system, that are later translated into the main actions performed by the bird during the day. So from eating to flying, passing through grooming, nesting, and flirting. And actions are then combined to create interactive patterns of social interchanges, offering a different perspective of sea and land colonization. The second one is about oil wells, whose identity deals with the notion of hidden or invisible patterns. That is to say, to rethink the dualistic logic of superficial versus deep towards a much more interesting superficial versus hidden. And it's a pattern that uses different performative intelligences, such as the geology and its logs, radiation, sonic waves, density, temperature, and fracking, together with the engineering system and infrastructural element as an organization of hidden layers of material expressivity to describe a complex and sometimes very controversial ecology. The third one is about the river Necken, where the pattern is formed not by the water and its course, but by mapping other intelligences whose performance and material expressivity are connected and are acting as a system composing the identity of the river. The ecology of the river is indeed described by the ecology of the different material organization that it encounters during its flowing from the source to the mouth. and the topography, the ecology of the riverbeds, the geology, the performance of its meanders, the presence or absence of different vegetative systems describe together the rationality of the river as almost an ecology of absence, where the great absence is actually the water itself. And last one is the opuntia, which is better known as the cactus, the pattern of which is the instantiation of a water retaining and storage system, where the microscopic readings and mapping of their morphological and physiological strategy to slow down perspiration and water losses by evaporation is telling us a story of environmental adaptation of a material system that works in extreme conditions with a very sophisticated networks of primary and secondary structures supporting a water storing tissue, which is gifted with small stomata, which are somehow working as thermal interfaces with the surrounding environment. So let's pass to another project. This is called a Resilient Skin Code, and it's an output of a 10 days workshop during the AA visiting school in Milan, which I co-directed together with Anat Stern from Zaha Hadid Architect. The teaching team was a very heterogeneous group of people that included experts in computation, digital fabrication, robotics, but also researchers in the world of textile design, like our craft tutor, the textile artist and designer Aranza Villas of Pinaki Studio. So the idea at the base of the workshop was, in fact, to promote a specific attitude of collaboration and contamination, not only in terms of disciplines and codes, but also in terms of methodologies in the educational sector. We had somehow noticed that all the discourse about digital technology was somehow detaching us as practitioners as much as educators from the material world, from the possibility to see a three-dimensional object, not only through a bidimensional screen, but also through its material expressivity. So at the end of the day, if you think about it, working with our hands, it's what makes us human. So we strongly believe that it was time for technology to embrace the heritage of craft. And as a matter of fact, Lee Edelcourt, who's one of the most influential trend forecaster at the moment, and he's also Dean of Hybrid Design Studies at Parsons School of Design in New York, when was interviewed about education in the School of Architecture, said the following: education should be changed. It should include textile. Textile is one of the most interesting things to learn because it's a form of geometry. So the whole idea of armure is like learning algebra and geometry and everything else. It's like a science. It's like reading in a way. If you learn it, things become more clear. So the workshop was organized with the aim to explore new relationships and links between different disciplines, and specifically between architecture and fashion design. During the last 2 decades, both disciplines have been drawing influences from each other in terms of form-finding processes, digital techniques, digital fabrication processes, and much more. But these two industries have in common also a darker side, which is that they are among the most polluting industries in the world. In fact, second to oil comes fashion, and it's directly followed by the construction business. So we were interested to discover if there was a way to combine the knowledge, the models, and the tools of these two disciplines in a sort of a cyborgian hybrid, capable to investigate and deal with the resilient scenarios of ecological praxis. In fact, if we look closely to these two disciplines, we can discover that they are not just iconic activities, they are also systemic activities. They are the mediums to organize relationship and communication between the three different worlds that we know: the spiritual, the physical, and the digital. So they are, in other words, capable to construct not just spaces or garments, but proper cognitive maps, which is to me the most interesting part about them. So working across disciplines could give us the possibility to merge successfully relational logics, material organization, communication protocols, aesthetics, fields of application, and scales of productions of disciplines that are as different as the ephemeral and temporary and soft and fragile fashion and the monumental, permanent, rigid, and durable architecture. And in order to do so, the research focused on the ergonomic scale. That is to say that we looked at architecture in the form of a small scale structure, some sort of shelter, and fashion in the form of a wearable construct. And both were explored to build a prototype which would lie somewhere between a shelter and a garment, and that we called the shelterment. So the students were asked to design a modular system which could perform and be flexible to all scales. So the design process included geometrical exploration as well as assembly methods, a modular system emerging from both fashion and architecture. And the modular system, expressed in the language of simple patterns, aimed to bridge the two disciplines, combining natural materials like the felt and craftsmanship with digitally fabricated components. So the digital workflow allowed to model design options on digital representation of body geometry and took advantage of form-finding processes to simulate fabric behavior. So the body geometry became a source of information that could allow reading inbuilt data and using them as input for design interactions. So with the use of computational tools, students were able to explore geometrical components and patterns behavior through several very quick iterative studies to then inform the analog workflow. And complexity became therefore more controllable, and design intent could be easily modeled and scripted and materialized. So all the, I call it, digital crafts produced responded to a different material and semiotic pattern connecting different forms of rationality. Now, this project that you see here, which is called Prosthetic Ecologies, an empathetic network of computational geology, is by a group of students from RC18 at the B-Pro Master at the Bartlett, where I teach history and theory. And it focuses on the advancing potentials of the Earth's crust with the aid of a prosthesis. The idea was to embed the Earth with synthetic technologies and mineral intelligence to reconstruct and demineralize metabolic system within cities. And the term mineral intelligence suggests a fundamental shift in the way we perceive the concept of intelligence according to a more inclusive approach. The need is to envision a non-linear material system that is capable to morph, to rearrange, and to adapt to its immediate surroundings, reinforcing the elemental relationship that natural systems inherently possess, and computing that into artificial system that begins to seamlessly communicate, collaborate, and exchange data. So the strategic use of digital tools to analyze the Earth's natural ability to facilitate optimum conditions for plant growth, and therefore recreating those conditions through computational design tools, hinges on the ability of the new geology to mimic specific characteristic of porosity, of permeability, and surface tension. And is trying to seek to generate a new epidermis or contact surface between the land and the city, recreating optimum conditions of plant growth, which requires recording of data that are invisible. So the ability to read this metabolism through computer visions and sensors helps give a voice to the plants and to communicate their precise needs for optimal yield through a data set of parameters for plant growth, such as, for instance, dimensions, light requirement, soil conditions, suggesting as far as pH values and moisture requirements. And this opens to me new avenues in the field of cybernetic ecologies, where the environment is giving a voice to communicate its needs within the machine to gain a sort of equilibrium. And the actants or urban actuators in this project are different forms of intelligence, both computational in the case of the sensing, analyzing, and communicating algorithms and interfaces, and non-computational in the case of humans and non-humans, such as the mineral layer, the plants, and the territory. This is another project, always from RC18 again, and it's called Generative Ecologies, Mass Customization of Symbiotic Ecologies. The design goal here was to push an amalgamation between human and non-human users, which should therefore create an empathetic bond between the human and the environment. The overall megastructure is a sort of a mixed-use development that you're looking at, and is designed to perform as an inhabited draining system, which is articulated according to a discrete modularity. So the initial setup of the structure starts with an interweaving pattern of both digital technology and physical data to create a cybernetic system of control that would respond both to humans and non-humans needs, like plants, animals, and insects. And the idea is that a computational generative process in the form of a multi-objective genetic algorithm would help to process the needs and contrasts of all the different ecologies, so to somehow balance the interactions among them in order to endure the new urban scenarios in a constant state of homeostasis. And here you can see how the system is composed by units, which are later arranged into clusters, which are capable to host activities. So each unit behaves as a macro structure that acts as an artificial prosthetic strategy to deal with different environmental characteristics, such as the sun, the humidity, and the ventilation, to create a different microclimatic condition. And the result is a sort of a synthetic habitat for humans and non-humans. And the macrostructure is further developed into a microstructure, which is the proper draining system, which is capable to deal with the specific local requirements of the vegetative layer. And also in this case, different environmental conditions, such as the density, the fluidity, and the porosity, are examined to create the performative pattern of the micro unit. Here you can see other responses to environmental conditions. And you can see here how the micro draining three-dimensional module populate the microstructure, and how the overall system behaves almost like a fractal cyborgian pattern. Okay, this is the last project I will present today, and it's coming from the practice. It's a competition in Beijing for a new cultural landmark, for which we have been awarded a special prize for innovation and sustainability. The project was done in collaboration with the Studio Relational Urbanism in London, and it's a contamination of an ancient Chinese technique through the use of digital technologies in order to create a sort of a structural ecological pattern. This is the site, which is located in Jiangfu Park between the Baja River and the Langma River, and is an ex-industrial site for the production of ceramics, with very typical warehouses with red bricks facades, very generous heights, but with roofs that were not anymore suitable for health and safety reasons. So the Baja River is an ancient canal which was constructed 800 years ago and was used to carry away the overspill water from the Grand Canal, preventing flooding to the Emperor City. And the site is one of the most important green pockets of Northeast Beijing, and it has a long and rich history as an ecological and biological resource, as you can see from the NDVI data map in the middle. And it has also another peculiarity. It happens to be located close to an area with mature resources of culture, art, science, and cultivated residents in the majority. So for this reason, the client was asking for a creation of a cultural hub. So the site, with its environmental and ecological character, needed to be emphasized and empowered. But at the same time, its historical nature with a post-industrial atmosphere was calling for a type of intervention that would keep the strong character of the place almost intact. So you can see how the vegetation has started to somehow crawl silently into the site following the railway tracks. And this vegetative contamination of the existing structures was suggesting a type of intervention that would bridge the two different realities, the park and the ex-industrial site, into one picture, creating a sort of a synergetic exchange among them, adding to the intervention a strong ecological value. So we started to search for a solution, an intelligence, I would say, that would enable these two apparently opposite conditions to coexist and to thrive from their own richness. And the answer was found looking into traditional Chinese architecture and was inspired by its complex and yet formidable technical construction, the dougong. This ancient technique evolved into a structural network that joined pillars and columns to frame the roof. And it's essential to the timber frame structure in traditional Chinese buildings because the walls in these structures are not load-bearing. So this discovery of this ancient construction method suggested that it was possible to avoid insisting on the old existing walls of the ex-factory to grant support for the new program. And effectively, after having removed the unsafe roofs, it was imaginable to leave the brick walls almost untouched, to just delineate spaces rather than to structure them, protecting instead the spaces with a new performing wooden structure. But most importantly, we wanted this new roof to perform not just as a shelter, but also as an ecological device capable to invest into this condition of contamination coming from the park, and to turn it into a device to respond to environmental issues, as well as to welcome and sustain the biological diversity coming from the nearby park. So the design process of the roof started with the analysis of the sections of the existing structure covering the train tracks as a sort of a way to recognize an historical value as a primordial generative act. And then it was accompanied by an environmental analysis of the site using different types of simulation processes, such as a multi-objective optimization model, to predict performances and to investigate spatial distribution of the program. And we also used swarm intelligence algorithm to simulate the decentralized, self-organized behavior of the people's movements within the space. Such a process of environmental and circulation analysis and program distribution developed into a pattern which was taking into consideration different material organization. A wooden tensile structure, which was the best performing structural configuration to minimize the use of material, a system of glass and titanium dioxide panels set up in the location where water and light were actually lighter. The titanium dioxide, by the way, is a special material which is capable to break down NO2 particles into harmless acid water and then later washed away by rain. And a system of winter gardens to host environmental pockets of vegetation, acting like a sort of ecological enhancers, regulating the internal temperature of the below spaces and embracing the park biodiversity. And at last, an articulated list of roof heights in order to have a differentiation of spaces with various qualities to host different programs. So the idea was really to create a contaminated doggang structure, which would work as a new landscape, as a new environment, and an added ecological value. In other words, a sort of a sustainable landmark. And here you can see our proposal as an aerial view. The entrance. An interior space. The ground floor with the different programs located into the warehouses and the railway track transformed into an ecological corridor. The first floor. And last, the view of the roof from the top. So, and here I conclude today's excursion on ecology, aesthetics, and contaminations. And I would like to conclude with this metaphysical image of collaborative rationalities by Tomás Saraceno, because it summarizes somehow the entire discourse that I've been trying to communicate today. It's a digital 3D scan of a cobweb, which is a special technique developed by the artist. So it's a piece where the intelligence of the spider, the one of the artist, and the one of the machines are a very poetic statement of a powerful contamination that Saraceno calls the rhizomatic web of life. But it's also a cartography of subjectivity, capable to, using Saraceno's words, tune in to the non-human voices that join ours in boundless connectivity canvases, proposing the rhizomatic web of life, which highlights hybridism between one species and another, and between species and worlds. So that's it, and I thank you very much for the attention of today.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Hilaria. Ahora abrimos a algunas preguntas, si es que hay. Todavía no ha llegado ninguna. Pero yo quería quizás ahondar un poco. Me puedes contestar en inglés igual, pero sé que entiendes perfectamente lo que digo. Entonces, no, ahondar un poco en lo que fue la experiencia con el curso esta última semana. Hubo un momento en el cual estuvimos conversando sobre la diferencia entre patrón y malla, entre mesh y pattern. Bueno, quizás interiorizarnos un poquito más en esos dos conceptos, cómo uno está dentro del otro, y cómo es la relación de las inteligencias que intentamos ver, que intentamos traducir a esos patrones, a esas mallas, en relación a estos conceptos, al concepto de malla y de patrón. Si podrías ahondar un poco más en eso.
I think the difference, or at least to me, there is not like one definition, but to me, the difference between patterns and meshes, if we want to use a sort of Deleuzian, Guattarian narrative, is the difference between virtual and actual. So patterns are, let's say, meshes are the virtual dimension of interconnectedness. So they express the virtuality of the concept of interconnectedness of all living beings, of this entangled world, while patterns are the actualization of this interconnectedness. So in a way, for me, patterns have a sort of more geometrical and arithmetical side compared to the meshes. I see the meshes more like as a sort of a theoretical tool image, and patterns more like an active tool for design. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yes, perfect. No, también estaba pensando en lo que tiene que ver con la cuestión de la autoría, cuando hablamos de patrones, algoritmos generativos, procesos automatizados de diferenciación. El rol del autor empieza siempre a ser algo recurrente como reflexión. No sé, en el caso tuyo, quizás haciendo hincapié en el último proyecto, que es de tu autoría total, que, en relación a estos procesos sistémicos, ¿cuál es el rol del autor o cómo emerge la cuestión de autoría en la era digital?
For me, in the digital era, there is a bit this passage from the mechanical era of design to the digital era of organization. So for me, the digital era is really about, for the author, to be able to organize all sorts of different inputs and intelligences that are coming to the design table. So algorithms are tools, but are also forms of intelligences, as much as we have what I mentioned, like forms of computational and non-computational, intelligences. So the author for me is somebody that can create this sort of chorus of collaborative nationalities between computational and non-computational intelligences. So where you can take on board through the use of technologies, voices that normally are silent, like sensors today, can tell us a lot about how plants perceive the environment. So if you can use sensor and you can use algorithms to read of the plants, somehow it's like plants talking to you, and you can incorporate in your project these different intelligence, these different needs. And I think that this is the powerful part of the digital organization, when you're not alone on taking responsibility, but it's actually a very beautiful sharing of responsibility in looking at the environment and the world that you are designing. So technology, it's here to help us, for me, to include all the possibilities of computational and non-computational ecologies.
Okay. Gracias. Aquí llegaron dos preguntas. Dice Patricia Mines, excelente y muy movilizadora charla. Pensaba que con tanta diversidad a incluir en un proceso de diseño, ¿cómo se podría definir el conjunto o recorte de variables a trabajar? ¿Cómo se definen los componentes de un patrón?
It's a very good question. It's basically what we have been dealing during the workshop, how you define it. Well, patterns are minds, as Bateson was saying. It means they represent an intelligence. And the intelligence, as I was saying, has many different articulations in reading the environment. And you can have components of the pattern that are more quantitative and others that are more qualitative. The way in which you decide to read the patterns is very much related to how much this pattern can talk to you. So if you can take advantage of technology, like I was mentioning before, the project about the plants, but for instance, in this moment at the Bartlett, we have a group of students who's working on a project where they take into consideration an entire set of animals that are normally present in the city, like foxes, badgers, bees, and squirrels. And through the sensors and through mapping their movements and their needs, they are trying to establish which kind of environment these different intelligences are in search for. And in doing this sort of exercise, they are building patterns. So in decoding the intelligences, you have the possibility to sort of list all the different components that you want to take into consideration. No? So at the end of the day, the author becomes sort of a curatorial, no? Character that has the power to choose what to include or not to include into the design process. No? So it exists, according to Latour, there is this parliament of things where everybody has a voice in the democracy of the planet. But at the end of the day, up to now, we are the speakers for these voices. So at the end of the day, we choose how to direct the design process, and therefore how to construct the pattern we want to talk, ¿no?
Yeah. Aquí tenemos otra de Sofía Menovich. Te pregunta, does the creation of a pattern ever get in the way of mapping in a loyal way the performance of the ecology? Do you think that sometimes it can turn into something very literal? How do you avoid that?
That's very true. I mean, she had experience during the workshop. It's very easy for a pattern to turn literal, no? It's when we are just mapping a behavior, that's a literal pattern. And it's interesting because every sort of reading and every sort of interpretation and lecture is very interesting, but at the same time is not that powerful. The powerful comes from the attitude that the reader puts in combining the pattern. No? So is the choice of all the different variables and the way in which these variables are combined to form a pattern. So it's not just the literal transfiguration of a certain mechanism into a pattern that makes it a tool. It's also including in this process a strategy. No? If we include the strategy, then the pattern becomes more and more powerful. Otherwise, it just stays as a mapping.
Okay. Manuel pregunta, different umwelts coexist in any territory, often overlapping, and most of the time they are entangled in violent conflicts. What are the politics of an impure ecology to approach these potential conflicts?
Conflict is contamination, no? So it's how you see it. Of course, we have to be open to deal with conflicts, because conflicts and contamination are, as I was saying, at the basis of the ecological discourse. So I think that it's a bit like the multi-objective genetic algorithm, no? Where you put a lot of different objectives inside the machine, and then the machine will compute a series of answers. It will not give you one answer. It will give you X answers. And then it's up to what you want to somehow achieve from your project, that you choose one rather than the other one. And all these different answers that the multi-objective algorithm gives are like many different interests. No? So it's like having many different umwelts at the same time. So you can somehow introduce them in the agenda. You can code them, decode them, and then have a series of answers. And then it's according to your strategy, to your goal, to your interest, that you will decide which one are going to prevail on top of the others. So it's about negotiation, but this is in any sort of political discourse, no? If you think about in general, the politics, it's always about negotiation. There is no politics without negotiation. So also the politics of the environment with different umwelts, they have to get into a negotiation territory. And if they can speak, then they can do it among each other. If they cannot, then they can do it through different kind of voices that can be, for instance, the ones that are enabled by digital technologies.
Bien, creo que esta pregunta está unida de alguna manera a eso. Marina Rodríguez Las Neves dice, I was wondering, how do you think that this design during time can learn from themselves or from changing type of context? Even more, how they can learn from disorder as higher levels of organization which can spontaneously emerge out of this disorder.
I mean, if we are talking about, for instance, technology, and we are thinking about, for instance, deep learning. Deep learning is a technology that is becoming more and more used in digital design. We actually use it quite a lot at the Bartlett. And it's a process that works exactly through trial and error, but it works in such a big amount of data that at a certain point, it starts to apprehend and learn by itself. So you don't have to feed it anymore. It learns. So they can learn from what for us is disorder. Why? Because if you think about it, for us, data, the amount of data that we encounter in every aspect of our life is somehow disorienting because it's too big, it's too massive. It's a quantity that our mind, the way in which human knowledge functions, cannot apprehend and cannot manage. But computers, they can. AI, artificial intelligence, through deep learning, can learn through huge amount of data, through the disorder that for us is disorder. They find logic inside. So in a way, if we want to rely and be positive about the role of AI in today's design field, I think this is one of the most interesting, is about the possibility of artificial intelligence to create order where we find disorder. No? And at the same time, I wouldn't be scared about disorder, no? Because as Milica was saying, disorder is somehow a form of dialogue. You just have to find the keys, and disorder can be, as it is a form of dialogue, is also a form of aesthetic experience. So it's just about how to manage disorder and how to channel it into a more efficient way of expression.
Okay. There is one more question from Sebastian Grill. It is a necessity for the ecological perspective to become the principal agenda of world politics, or should the ecological perspective build power on its own? Good one.
I think they go hand in hand, no? Somehow. The ecological agenda is already building a lot of power on its own, but unfortunately, it's more on the theoretical level. There are a lot of very interesting theoreticians, like some of them named today, Timothy Morton, Graham Hartman, Jane Bennett, Bruno Latour. They are all, Timothy Morton again, they are all building up a very strong and sound discourse about ecology and the role of ecology in our lives and in politics. The problem is that the kind of language that they use is very cryptical towards the majority of the people. And if it becomes cryptical, is not very easily transmissible. So I think that politics are essential because they have the duty to somehow transfer all this knowledge and power that is built up independently on the topic into more manageable parts and to a more understandable kind of discourse, so that it becomes almost obsolete not to talk about it. So for me, the roles of politics is not just about an active role of intervention and action, but also of distribution of information to a level that it can be absorbed by the majority of the people. Because as I was mentioning a few days ago, the real problem about ecology is that many of the discourse are hidden. And there are many layers of the ecological discourse that lay underground, that are not understood, or they just lay hidden. And that's why many people can allow themselves not to believe it, as if it was a sort of religion, because as religion, you don't see it, you don't touch it. It has this level of not being completely visible. And this has to disappear. It has to become very visible. It has to become very obvious. And I think that politics can help. An ecological political discourse has meaning just when it becomes very, not exclusive, no, but shared.
Okay. Well, we are finishing now. Thank you very much, Ilaria. I think it was a very, very productive week with the students for the program. And this lecture was a very nice way to end this productive week. So thank you very much for the workshop and for this lecture. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks to you. It was a real pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.